Our reading this morning comes from 2 Samuel. We've been going through this and looking at the life of David. 2 Samuel chapter 6, and I'll call someone forward now to read that. I'll try to find a volunteer. Yes, you'll do. Thank you.
2 Samuel chapter 6. The ark brought to Jerusalem. David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. He and all his men set out from Baalah of Judah to bring up the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was still on the hill. Uzzah and Ahoio, son of Abinadab, were guiding a new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahoio was walking in front of it. David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with songs and with harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of the irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day the place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How could the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has, because of the ark of God." So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of David, of the Lord, and set it in its place inside the tent, and that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offering and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to him and met him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of slave girls, of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by the slave girls you speak of, I will be held in honour." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. This is the word of the Lord.
When I grew up in New Zealand, I participated in a number of church settings. I experienced both the traditional and the charismatic church, and I saw the extremes. I saw what some mocked as the frozen chosen, lifeless, constrained by tradition and lacking in emotion. And I also saw the extremes of the so-called spiritual freedoms and expressions of the charismatic church. I was in congregations where the people up front laughed uncontrollably on the floor, where people mulled together on their hands and knees, making animal noises as a supposed sign of being touched by God. In this chapter, the Ark of the Lord is brought to Jerusalem. And there are two significant images that are difficult to bring together. We have the man who unthinkingly steadies the Ark of God and drops dead as a consequence. Now, if I just spoke on this part in isolation, I might warn you to be careful with God, not to mess around with him. I might even encourage you to be reserved. In the second half of this passage, we see King David stripping off his kingly robes and dancing around almost like a maniac. Now, if I just preached on the second half, I might tell you to let it all hang out, to go for gold no matter what anyone else thinks, to be ridiculous even. But nothing in Scripture should be spoken out of context. Nothing should be taken on its own. We need to bring these things together. And so as I look at this chapter, the question I want to ask from this chapter and to ask of you is, how should we conduct ourselves in this world before a holy God? In the previous chapter, and it's been a long journey, David is finally anointed king over all. He's king of Israel. His palace has been built in a walled Jerusalem. And he has successfully fought off the Philistine hordes. God's king is in God's place, Jerusalem, Zion, and the city of David. David acknowledged that the Lord had established his throne, and he continued to seek his wisdom and his influence. But there's something missing. David wanted to see established again, now in Jerusalem, the Ark of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of God, engraved and ornamented, a treasure chest with important memorabilia inside, representing the very presence of God. It was a sign of God being with his people, and David wanted it to be now in Jerusalem. He intended that his kingship would be a kingship marked by the presence of God. By bringing the ark to Zion, David is saying that God's presence can no longer remain on the edges, but must be central. It must be a central focus and a reality of the Davidic kingdom. The ark in Jerusalem proclaims that the majestic, pardoning God is a speaking God who is in the midst of his people. And so David reassembled his army, 30,000 young men, and brought them together. We see this in verse 1. This time not to attack or to defend, but to together collect the Ark of God. The Ark was significant. It spoke of their history. It contained the gold jar of manna. It contained Aaron's staff that had miraculously budded. And it contained the 2 tablets, the 10 commandments of the covenant. And so the Ark of the Covenant marked God's presence, his power, his provision, and his guidance. Now today we, of course, no longer have the Ark as a sign of God's presence. We don't have to go on a raid for the so-called lost Ark. We now have a greater reality than that. We have the Son of God, the Lord Jesus, with us. The one whose name is Emmanuel, which means God with us. But for David, this Ark represented the very presence of God in their midst. And so we read that in verse 3 that the Ark of God was put on a cart and brought from the house of Abinadab. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. And they had castanets and harps and lyres and timbrels and sistrums and cymbals. It would have been quite a spectacle. And notice how glad they were. They celebrated not half-heartedly, but with all their might. It wasn't that the box had any power of its own, but it represented for all Israel the presence and the power of God. And now, as it were, their God was coming home. He was taking up residence in the king's city. The exuberance would have been amazing to watch. David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. And it's a basic thing for God's people that God's presence brings rejoicing. Note the instruments Note how many there are, their variety. I think that for much of my life in the church, almost 40 years, there's been an ongoing debate about not only whether instruments are biblical, but which instruments are biblical. Try telling this to David and his men. There has also been an undergirding suspicion about those who get too exuberant in church. This fair was foreign to David's crowd. They celebrated with all their might. Yes, of course, there's been times when people have made a show of themselves in church, been distracting, drawn unnecessary attention to themselves. Jesus himself spoke against those who conduct their religious activities with trumpets and fanfare. But here we see David and his men excited by the prospect of the ark of God and all that it signified, coming home. Their focus is not on themselves. Their focus is on God, and they're justifiably excited and not afraid to show it. And it's one thing you appreciate about David is that before God he wore his heart on his sleeve. When you read the Psalms, 150 of them, you see a man open and honest before God. There is not an emotion, whether it's doubt, complaint, despair, anger, joy, enthusiasm, whatever. There's not an emotion that he does not bring before God. David, under God and the Scriptures, gives us permission, indeed instruction and example, to bring our whole selves before God. Not only does he instruct us to bring our sadness and despair before God, but he also helps us worship God in gladness and in joy. But what happened next might temper things a little bit. The cart was being carried on an ark, and maybe they should have used those poles and ringlets that were provided. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, and as you can see, that the floor is quite bumpy and a little bit unstable for a cart with a treasure box on it. And as they go through the threshing floor, the oxen stumble with the uneven surface. And on first reading, Uzzah does what seems quite natural. He takes hold of the ark to secure it. But what happens next might come as a shock, and it might even seem to be an overreaction. Verse 7 tells us that the Lord considered this act despicable and struck him down, and he fell down dead beside the ark of God. To an onlooker, it would be as if the box was electrically charged, and having touched the ark of the covenant, Uzzah receives an electric shock and is killed instantly. We're told in verse 7 that the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. But when we first see this, we are taken aback, aren't we? After all, Uzzah was only trying to help. What was Uzzah supposed to do? Let the ark bounce around until it fell off the cart. But God wasn't being capricious. The Bible describes his act in verse 7 as irreverent, a word that means showing lack of respect for people or things that are generally taken seriously. In Numbers, they were warned not to touch these holy things. And there's more than a few times in the Bible where God manifests himself in his justice and says, don't forget what and who you are messing about with here. Later on in the New Testament, Ananias and Sapphira were both struck down dead for lying about their offering to God. It's quite a stark lesson, but one we all need to be reminded of. Do we know the God with whom we're dealing? And do we treat him with the appropriate degree of seriousness? One of my sons had an unfortunate but brief habit of calling me bro. I made sure it was brief. There is something important to learn about treating authority with respect and reverence, and that increases in importance as the authority is more weighty. And it doesn't get more weighty than dealing with the maker of the heavens and the earth, the creator of the bottomless and raging seas, the deep valleys and the towering mountains. It's an overused illustration, but there are few better than the book called The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where Lucy is introduced to God, represented by a lion called Aslan. Mr. Beaver tells Susan that Aslan, the ruler of Narnia, is a great lion. Susan is surprised and she assumed Aslan was a man. She then tells Mr. Beaver, I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. She asked Mr. Beaver if Aslan is safe, to which Mr. Beaver replies, "Safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king." When we come before God, it is a very holy thing. We who are flawed and sinful coming before a holy God is like a piece of hay coming within centimetres of the sun. And the Bible teaches us that it is only due to the protection of Jesus, due to the great exchange that we celebrated at Easter, whereby believing in Jesus, we are clothed in his righteousness and he takes our sin, that we can even dare to stand in God's presence. Only then, believing in Jesus, do we stand a chance of lasting before him. And in that manifestation of the righteous indignation of God, David is reminded of who he is dealing with and he responds appropriately. He takes God a lot more seriously, so serious that he says, "How can I survive if the presence of God draws close to me? I'm not worthy. My God is too big, too mighty, too holy, too high, and too pure." David says in verse 9, How could I survive? How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? People sometimes say to me, if I came into the church, it might fall down. God says no one can see me and live. And I usually speak of God's amazing grace and how that three of the greatest men in the Bible, Moses, David and Paul, were all murderers, and yet through Jesus were able to draw near to God. David decided then and there that he would keep God at a distance and instead took the ark of the Lord to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. It's a poor compromise when we decide to put God at the margins of our lives because he makes our lives, or might make our lives, too uncomfortable. That he might shake us up a little, so we just keep him at the edge. Verse 11 tells us that while the ark of the Lord remained in Obed-Edom's house, there was great blessing that spread to and through the entire household. This is a bit like nuclear energy. For countries that have it, especially in Europe and particularly in France, it provides a lot of low, clean, good energy. But at the same time, there's always the risk and fear that another Chernobyl might be just around the corner. As far as Obed-Edom is concerned, having the ark of God in his house was like sitting on a free-flowing gold mine. Now, it doesn't always work like that. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, this same ark is giving everyone cancer. So Obed-Edom becomes the guinea pig, and as far as his household is concerned, it's a pretty good experiment. It seems to be that where the God of Israel is recognised and honoured, the symbol of his presence brings blessing, but where the same God is ignored and despised, there is a curse. Well, it didn't take David long, did it, to see what was happening in the household of Obed-Edom. And he got blessing envy. And he concluded that he was missing out, that Jerusalem, indeed all Israel, was missing out by keeping God at a safe distance. A few years ago, there was a lady who came to faith in our church from a difficult background, and the Lord turned her life around. And it wasn't long before her daughter came to me and said, "I want what Mum's got. I want to see my life change. I want to see what's happened to her happen to me." There was this whole paradigm shift then, and David's mind was turned around, that he decided it was far better to be blessed than to be overly cautious. David didn't just reluctantly concede to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Once he had set his mind on it, that God would be in the centre of his city's life, he did it with immense joy and enthusiasm, with rejoicing and ceremony. This would be a watershed moment for Israel, a great day to be commemorated. And so David went to bring the ark, verse 12, from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Now I'm sure you've heard all the jokes about David's attire. It says in verse 14 that he was wearing a linen ephod. And there's all these jokes about David dancing in his underpants. One of the most tasteful pictures I've found was this one. But this idea that David was dancing in his scanty whities is encouraged, first of all, by David's wife, Michal, who comments that David was going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. But if we turn to 1 Chronicles, we get some additional information. 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 27, where it says that David was clothed in a robe of fine linen, as were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, and as were the musicians and Kenaiah, who was in charge of the singing of the choirs. David also wore a linen ephod, not just a linen ephod. In other words, David was probably dressed more like the people behind him in this picture than the scantily clad man in front. And the point for David of dressing like all the other servants, I believe, is that David didn't want to just to stand out as a king. He didn't want to draw attention to himself for his royalty. He was celebrating God before God, like his brothers and with his brothers. It's one of the reasons many church pastors have shied away from dog collars and purple hats. But even so, this was still pretty unusual to see the king like this. Verse 14, I believe, is the key verse of this whole chapter. It says, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. He wasn't just dancing, he was dancing before the Lord and dancing with all that he had. When I first entered the church as a believer, as a young teenager, one of the things that impressed me early on was to see older men with their eyes closed, with their hands raised and worshipping God, lost in wonder, love and praise. And I thought to myself then and there that this God that I'd found, this gospel I'd discovered, that it doesn't get tired. Looking at them, I saw that this was for life. As far as David was concerned, everybody else had disappeared and he was dancing before an audience of one. For David, a man after God's own heart, being aware of the Lord freed him to express himself and to be all that he was and all that he could be. It's tragic, isn't it, that so many people dance half-hearted, guarded dances because it's a dance before others and not a dance before the Lord. When you dance mindfully of the Lord, who knows you intimately, it frees you also before others. David didn't dance alone, he just led the procession, but he danced before the Lord with all his might. And do you see how important this is to hold this chapter together? The answer to balancing fear and exuberance is not moderation. Do you see how God calls us to be both people who are filled with joy and yet tremble before his holiness? Do you see both these emphases strongly portrayed within this one chapter? Fearfulness and gladness are held together. Dale Ralph Davies says, in God's presence you should both shudder and dance. That a fearful sense of God's holiness does not suppress joy, but stimulates it. Or as David put it together so succinctly and so well in Psalm 2, verse 11, when he said these three words, rejoice with trembling. There are people in life who, if you let them influence you, they will inhibit you. They will make you feel uncomfortable. They have you in a box and they want you to stay there. And while David was having the time of his life, while David experienced a deep moment of enormous significance, not just for himself but for the whole city, his exuberance was making someone else feel most uncomfortable. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city, verse 16 tells us, David's wife, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. And how much you let that affect you depends on how much you let that affect you. And that has a lot to do with how wrapped up you are in God. The ark of the Lord was set in place inside a tent David had pitched for it. Sacrifices and offerings were made before the Lord, and David pronounced a great blessing on the people in the name of the same Lord Almighty, their God. And as a symbol of that blessing, he gave freshly baked bread, date loaf and raisin scones to everyone in attendance. It was a big day, and David returned home with one special blessing to go. He returned home to bless his household. His wife Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and preempted his flowing blessings with sarcasm and bile. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. What was her issue? I believe the heart of her outrage was that David, King David, had discarded his kingly attire and protocol and was dressed instead like a mere Levite and not a king. David could have worn any number of outfits for the ark procession. He could have worn his royal robes. He could have worn his military regalia. He could have worn a king's public robe. But instead he chose to wear a Levitical robe. And then he likely girded it, tucked it in, so he could dance and dance like a fool. This was so inappropriate. On every level he was undignified. Michal was concerned with royal dignity, proper decorum, outward appearances. But David's mind was elsewhere. He was dancing before the Lord with all his might. And you've got to love David's response. He effectively says to Michal, I wasn't dancing for you. David says to Michal in verse 21, it was before the Lord who chose me, who appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. A lesser man, a more compromised man, a weaker man, a less God-obsessed man would have crumbled. David was totally unperturbed. He basically goes on to say, you ain't seen nothing yet, and he ramps it up. In verse 22, he says, I'm going to become even more undignified than this. I'll be humiliated, so humiliated and unusual that I'll look odd in my own eyes. I can give two hoots about protecting my honour when I'm celebrating God's honour. And before my God, I will not be held back from dancing and celebrating his presence with me, with us, this day or any day. David danced before the Lord with all his might. Michal's life became a picture of what happens when you shut God out and are more concerned with how you appear and what people might say. There's nothing for you in the end. You become barren and lifeless. It's one thing to be held back by people like Michal. It's even worse to be a Michal, not just depriving yourself of the joy of the Lord, but wanting to restrain everyone else as well. David danced before the Lord with all his might. And so I want to ask in conclusion, what about you? Have you kept God at a safe distance? Are you held back by a multitude of Michals looking down on you? Or will you determine, like David, to express and experience all that God has for you? It's one of the worst traits of our tradition that we somehow think it is godly to not show emotion, to not get excited about the things of God and the presence of God. I'm not asking you to be unnatural. I understand if it's not your nature to get excited. If you can play golf and get a hole in one and merely respond with, bravo, nice shot. If you can watch a grand final and see your team win in the final seconds and merely give a half-hearted thumbs up. If you can watch the final scene of the Titanic and not be moved, then fine. But to be mature and expressive in your emotions everywhere except the church, except for the things of God, is a travesty. Theologian W.G. Blakey says, there are doubtless times to be calm and times to be enthusiastic. But can it be right to give all our coldness to Christ and all our enthusiasm to the world? Simply put, does the presence of God ever move you? If you think I'm trying to encourage dancing in church, then you have missed the point. Find your own dance. David danced before the Lord with all his might. Will you dance? Will you dance before the Lord? Will you dance before the Lord with all your might? This day and every day. Don't wait for heaven to celebrate what God gives you now. Let us pray. Our Holy Father, we thank you for what this chapter teaches us about your majesty and might and holiness. And Lord, we pray that we might worship you with joy mixed with trembling. That we might come before you a holy God, realizing our unworthiness, but in Jesus knowing that we can stand before you and come boldly even because Jesus has made it possible. He has taken our sin and given us his righteousness. And so we stand before you clothed in white garments, clothed in your righteousness. And we rejoice. Lord, I pray that you would help us to worship you freely, wholeheartedly. That, Lord, by our lives we would show what really moves us, that we would be moved more than anything else by the fact that there is a holy God who takes an interest in us. That this would be the thing that excites us more than anything else, that like David, we would live our lives before you, and that we would live our lives unhindered, that we would live our lives with all our might, because you have given everything for us, and you are worthy of all glory. In Jesus' name.